In the eastern portion of mainland Southeast Asia lies Vietnam, the S-shaped socialist nation. In the 3rd century BCE, China's expansion occupied that land and eventually became an independent state in 938 CE, living in a society that mimicked Chinese culture.
The Vietnamese lived peacefully until the French invaded in 1857 by Napoleon III under the pretext of the Civilisation, or civilizing mission. What they really invaded Vietnam for was the purpose of profit, economic exploitation, wanting territory, resources, raw materials, and cheap labor. Capturing Saigon in 1859 and establishing a permanent military foothold on the south. The French couldn't advance any further because of the Vietnamese resistance, and it took up until 1861 under new management to occupy the 3 adjacent provinces. Unable to mount an effective resistance, the Vietnamese concluded a peace treaty in 1862, which gave conquered territories to France, and 5 years later, additional territories were given to the French. This entire colony was renamed Cochin China. 1873, an attempt was made to enter the Red River Delta after French naval officer and explorer named Francis Garnier showed that the Mekong River could not serve as a trade route into southwestern China. Garnier, with a small band of troops, seized positions in the Red River Delta until hired Chinese bandits attacked and killed Garnier. Following this defeat, a withdrawal was negotiated from northern Vietnam in early 1874. In 1882, France returned with support from Paris and took over the entire Red River Delta. August 1883, the Vietnamese signed a treaty that turned northern and central Vietnam into French protectorates, and on October 17, 1887, formed French Indochina with a couple countries around Vietnam.
With full French control, Vietnam's economy was transformed into a proto-capitalistic system based on land ownership, mass production, exports, and lower wages. In 1897, under Governor General Paul Doumer, French rule was exacted upon all levels of administration, and Vietnamese emperors were replaced with others willing to serve the French. Peasants lost their land after failing to repay loans with massive interest rates, causing their land to be seized for production purposes. Land used for the purpose of rice farming quadrupled, while rice consumption decreased for peasants, with most being exported. Where there were labor shortfalls, Vietnamese farmers were recruited en masse from outlying villages. Sometimes they came voluntarily, lured by false promises of high wages. However, in other cases, they were forcibly conscripted. The railroads, highways, harbors, bridges, canals, and other public works built by the French were almost started under Doumer, whose aim was a rapid and systematic exploitation of Indochina's potential wealth for the benefit of France. Vietnam was to become a source of raw materials and a market for tariff-protected goods produced by French industries. The exploitation of natural resources for direct export was the chief purpose of all French investment, with rice, coal, rare materials, and later also rubber as the main products. The workers on plantations in French Indochina worked long hours in debilitating conditions for wages that were barely enough to survive. Some were paid in rice rather than money. The working day could be as long as 15 hours, sometimes without breaks or adequate food and fresh water. Introduced in 1901, the corvée required male peasants of adult age to complete 30 days of unpaid work on government buildings, roads, dams, and other infrastructure. French colonial laws prohibited corporal punishment, but many overseas used it anyway, beating slow or reluctant workers. It was not uncommon for plantations to have several workers die in a single day.
In 1885, a broad resistance movement led by the scholar Phan Ding Fung, whose rebellion collapsed only after his death in 1895. This resistance collapsed as they were filled with ideas of pre-colonial Vietnam, and these aspirations had little meaning for the newer generations. A new national movement arose in the early 20th century. Its most prominent leader, Tan Boi Chau, whose ideas rejected French rule but not Western ideas, science, and technology. In 1805, Chau went to Japan. His plan was to free Vietnam with Japanese help. Chow smuggled hundreds of young Vietnamese into Japan, where they studied the sciences and underwent training for clandestine organization, political propaganda, and terrorist action. Inspired by Chow's writings, nationalist intellectuals in Hanoi opened the Free School of Tonkin in 1907, which soon became a center of anti-French ideals and was suppressed after a few months. Some of Chow's followers would be arrested and were condemned to death, while others were sent to Ton Son Island, a French-turned penal camp for Vietnamese nationalists. Fanboy Chow went to China in 1910, where he set up a republican government in exile to attract the support of nationalist groups. After the French arranged his arrest and imprisonment in China, his movement began to decline. In 1925, Chow was seized by French agents in Shanghai and brought back to Vietnam for trial. He died under house arrest in 1940.
After World War I, the movement for national liberation intensified. A number of intellectuals sought to achieve reforms by obtaining political concessions through collaborations with the French. The failure of such reformist efforts led to a revival of the Vietnamese National Party, which had a plan to oust the French in a military uprising. Between the nights of February 9th and 10th, 1930, the troops of one garrison killed their French officers, but they were overwhelmed a day later and were executed. A wave of repression followed that took hundreds of lives and sent more to prison camps. 5 years earlier, Nguyen Ai Wook, better known by his later pseudonym of Ho Chi Minh, became the most prominent leader in the national movement. In June 1925, Ho Chi Minh had founded the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam, the predecessor of the Indochinese Communist Party. Ho Chi Minh had left Vietnam in 1911 and traveled wildly before settling in Paris in 1917. He joined the Communist Party of France in 1920 and later spent several years in Moscow and China in the service of the international communist movement. After making his Revolutionary Youth League the most influential of all resistance groups, he succeeded in the early 1930s in forming the Vietnamese Communist Party. In May of that year, the communists exploited conditions of near starvation over large areas of central Vietnam by staging a broad peasant uprising, during which numerous Vietnamese officials and many landlords were killed, and administrations were set up in several provinces of Annam. It took the French until the spring of 1931 to suppress this movement.
Unlike the VNQDD and some smaller nationalist groups, the Indochinese Communist Party recovered quickly from the setback of 1931. After 1936, when the French extended some political freedoms to the colonies, the party extended its influence among intellectuals, workers, and peasants. When political freedoms were again curtailed at the outbreak of World War II, the Communist Party was forced back into hiding. During World War II, Indochina was a French-administered possession of Japan. On September 22, 1940, after the fall of France to the Nazis, Japan was permitted to station Japanese troops in Indochina. The French administration cooperated with the Japanese forces and was ousted in March 1945, when the Japanese began to fear that the French forces might turn against them as defeat approached. Meanwhile, in May 1941, at Ho Chi Minh's urging, the Communist Party formed a broad national alliance under its leadership called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, which subsequently became known as the Viet Minh. Ho was arrested and imprisoned by the nationalist government in China. After his release, he returned to Vietnam and began to cooperate with Allied forces by providing information on Japanese troop movements in Indochina. When the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, the Viet Minh ordered a general uprising, and, with no one organized to oppose them, they were able to seize power in Hanoi. Bao Dai, the Vietnamese emperor, abdicated a few days later and declared his fealty to the newly proclaimed Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The French, however, were determined to restore their colonial presence in Indochina, and, with the aid of British occupation forces, seized control of Cochin China. Thus, at the beginning of 1946, there were two Vietnams, a communist north and a non-communist South. Negotiations between the French and Ho Chi Minh led to an agreement in March 1946 that promised a peaceful solution. Under the agreement, France would recognize the Viet Minh government and give Vietnam the status of a free state. French troops were to remain in Vietnam, but they would be withdrawn progressively over 5 years.
Operation between the French and the Viet Minh, their policies were irreconcilable. The French aimed to re-establish colonial rule, while Hanoi wanted total independence. French intentions were revealed in the decision of Georges Thierry d'Argentlieu, the High Commissioner for Indochina, to proclaim Cochin China an autonomous republic in June 1946. Later, negotiations did not resolve the differences between the French and the Viet Minh,
on the battlefield to gain a diplomatic advantage. He knows that his paratrooper and Foreign Legion forces are vital to offensive operations, but their manpower is being used up defending almost 900 garrisons all across Indonesia.
Confident of victory, the French ignored the real political cause of the war. French efforts to deal with those issues were ineffective. The French reunited Cochin China with the rest of Vietnam in 1949, proclaiming the Associated State of Vietnam, and appointed the former Emperor Bao Dai as chief of state. Most nationalists, however, denounced these maneuvers as leadership in the struggle for independence from the French remained with the Viet Minh. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh waged an increasingly successful guerrilla war, aided after 1949 by the new communist government of China. The United States, fearful of the spread of communism in Asia, sent large amounts of aid to the French. The French, after losing at the Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, agreed to negotiate an end to the war at an international conference in Geneva. The agreements concluded in Geneva between April and July 1954 were signed by French and Viet Minh representatives and provided for a ceasefire and temporary division of the country into two military zones at latitude 17 degrees north. All Viet Minh troops were to withdraw north of that line, and all French Associated State of Vietnam troops were to remain south of it. An international commission composed of Canadian, Polish, and Indian members was established to supervise the execution of the agreement.